Hello and welcome. My name is Fiona Harvey. I'm the environment correspondent for The Guardian, and I am here to welcome you to today's event on getting net zero right. We'll be looking, first of all, at the history of net zero, what net zero is, why it's important as a concept, why we even talk about it, where it came from. We'll also be looking at some of the issues around net zero. There's been some controversy around net zero recently, and there have been questions from many people about what net zero means in the run-up to COP26. COP26, of course, happening in November in Glasgow, and will be the most important climate change conference since Paris in 2015. So it's absolutely vital that we get this right if we're to avoid the worst ravages of climate change and if we're to keep the world within 1.5 degrees of global heating. So really the stakes couldn't be higher. And today we've got an hour and a half. We're going to discuss it's a huge topic. There's an awful lot within net zero and the idea of how we get to net zero. There's an awful lot to cover. So we'll be taking it in chunks. First of all, we'll be looking back a bit towards the history of net zero. We'll then look at the kind of the current debate, what's happening around net zero. And then we will also have a chance for you, the audience, to take part. You'll be able to ask questions and make comments on what you hear. So we've got a very packed event for you. And I'm going to start by introducing Farhana Yamin, who is with us here today to talk about the history of net zero. And Farhana, you have been involved in this for many years, and you have huge experience as an activist, as a legal advisor, as an expert on net zero. And I think that you can lay claim to being, well, shall we say, one of the progenitors of the idea of net zero. Perhaps you could take us into that a bit more.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you to the champions and the COP26 team, and to all the panelists too, who are fellow travellers on this very long journey, which I started in 1991 as advisor to the small island states, and have more or less been involved in continuously, including attending 24 COPs. And the origins of this idea did come from me in proposing to remedy what was a huge legal and scientific gap in the regime. In fact, Laurence Toubiana headed up a think tank called IDRI. I'm holding up the paper in which she commissioned from me and my two co-authors, Nicholas Hearn and Eric Heites, and asked, what is the learnings and what are the gaps? What could be a balanced architecture for Paris? And this paper was commissioned in January of 2013, and the final peer-reviewed paper came out in 2013, and it was the most downloaded paper on IDRI's website, I think. So it informed a huge deal of thinking in the COP. And essentially the net zero idea was there to balance out and provide a scientific anchor and provide a measurable anchor for mitigation efforts. It was balanced out by proposals that were also being put forward for a global goal on adaptation, which is included also in Paris. But you have to understand that these three battered, treaties that I'd taken part in the Climate Change Convention and the Kyoto Protocol actually did not contain scientific backbones. They did not have a global cap or even a link to the science in the sense of a cumulative budget. That came much later. And they allowed parties legally to have a vacuum in terms of proposing emissions reductions that could go up as well as down. So even the Kyoto Protocol, which is addressed to richer countries, said that parties had to come forward with CELROs, which were quantified objective limitation targets, and reduction and limitation targets. And the word limitation was included to allow for growth targets, even for these richer countries. So looking as a lawyer and looking back on all of the 25 years before Paris, what we'd learned was we needed to have a direct link with the science in terms of making sure that we had some kind of global stop date And that date had to tie in with what we were arguing at that time, which was the well below 2 degrees and 1.5. And the 1.5 limit was put forward by most of the vulnerable countries in Copenhagen at COP15, which was in 2009. So these scientific gap, i.e. no scientific parameter, and the legal gap, no actual commitment, no actual legal obligations to reduce emissions to get to that end point, were the reasons why we put forward this top-down element. And the final reason was, it was becoming very clear by this time that the parties would not accept a Kyoto-like structure which had quantified targets. They would be essentially putting forward targets that were nationally determined. What we came up with, this vocabulary, nationally determined commitments, voluntary, self-proposed targets. So we felt there had to be some measure, some global metric which would guide those mitigation efforts. So that was the background back in 2013, and it came to be included in the Paris Agreement largely as a result of the advocacy and the championing of many, many, many people, but principally the vulnerable countries who saw it as a counterpart to the 1.5 limit. So this was seen as a more quantified metric along with that 1.5 limit, which had been fought tooth and nail. As I said, its inclusion, its reference, even a decision on it had been blocked since 2009. So by the time we got to Paris, it was like, let's have belt and braces, let's do a number of different approaches to take care of the scientific and legal vacuums.
And just on that question of 1.5 versus 2 degrees, why is that distinction important? Because, for most of us, if we were sitting in a room, we wouldn't be able to tell the difference if it was, half a degree hotter or colder. It doesn't seem like that big a difference in the scheme of things. Why is this difference crucial?
Well, this small temperature is difference globally because actually human beings have already altered globally the planet by about 1 degree. And we're seeing the consequences of that raise in global temperatures. If you heat up the atmosphere, the seas, waterways, glaciers, all sorts of consequences happen at a planetary level. It's true that in our individual daytimes, we negotiate the temperature between night and day. It varies by 10 degrees or so, but the global average long-term temperature is what scientists are worried about. And in fact, the science was always saying, even by 2009, as I said, that this 1.5 degree limit was a much safer limit. There is no safe limit. There are always consequences, but this was a safer limit. And it basically took until the Paris Agreement and that leverage that these vulnerable countries had to say, no, actually, it's not 2 degrees. We should be aiming for well below 2 degrees and 1.5. And then the scientific community rose to the challenge, again, as a result of the Paris mandate to produce a report by the IPCC, which came out in 2018, which demonstrably, and I hope, definitively showed what a massive difference that 0.5 degrees makes. It means that billions of people are put at more stress in terms of water insecurity. Billions more people are put at stress of food insecurity. Many more cities are vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surges and all of the other things that are now well known just from that half a degree difference on a planetary level.
Great. So it really is very important to aim to stay within 1.5 degrees rather than allowing warming to continue to 2 degrees. That's a very important point. Why, you've talked about the Paris Agreement and the lead up to it and so on. Why aren't the words net zero in the Paris Agreement?
Why aren't they? Because this was a hugely contested concept. It wasn't a concept that was readily agreed. And this link to the science has always been in the legal agreements pushed out. So the idea that we would have to have a phase out, an end essentially to fossil fuel production and to balance our agricultural emissions, deforestation, land use change related emissions, was hugely contested by countries that are heavily dependent on fossil fuel production. It was hugely contested by countries who were in the front lines of having to make cuts to coal, for example. They didn't want to see a phase out. They didn't want any clear language. So it was really ingenuity and legal, maneuverings, and a huge amount of diplomatic savviness, both from the champions of high ambition, including the High Ambition Coalition, as well as many people behind the scenes, that led to this language of emissions being balanced. So we tried a number of different vocabularies. You're negotiating with 195 parties, and thousands of negotiators are involved, and words, sometimes through the sausage of the negotiation, don't come out as cleanly as we would like. So we would have liked a much clearer definition. We would have liked a zero in energy-related CO2 emissions for a start. And that's actually my own history, has been putting forward CO2-related emissions reduction commitments since 1991. That was the first protocol I ever drafted, was for the small island states, and was put forward in 1994. So it's not like we haven't understood that there are problems with the vocabulary. It's just that the power of vested interest and powerful countries, means that they have a veto in negotiations about what vocabularies they accept. But I'm very glad that in the end, the Paris Agreement is read as requiring what science now demands and what equity and fairness now demands. And in the light of the IPCC report, which came out in 2018, it is read and it is accepted, and world leaders have now signed off on this global goal. And more and more countries are stepping up, more and more companies are stepping up and trying to align now their own trajectories, their own businesses, their own pathways to this goal. So that's a huge achievement. As I said, I would have loved greater legal clarity and the final hammer and the final say, but Laurence and others who are on this call know how hard it is to get everything that you want. So we were pleased to see these two references, and the references also to long-term emission strategies, which is also included, and which does have a very clear 2050 target at the end of them.
Great. So we did get a good agreement in Paris that did point towards net zero, even if the words weren't in there. We then had the IPCC report that came a couple of years after Paris, setting out why 1.5 would be much, much better as a limit than 2 degrees, because of what, the changes that you've outlined, the much, much greater stresses that will be avoided if we stick to 1.5 degrees. And did the IPCC report, did that give a greater impetus, do you think, to net zero?
Absolutely, because I think the IPCC report really defined the carbon budget approach. And I think it's since then we've had much greater clarity. So what we were trying to achieve, and again, frustrations from my side that things can't happen quickly, but the tightening up of the cap, the tightening up of the legal date, the tightening up of the definitions of the vocabularies that are used, from carbon neutrality to net zero to zero, takes time when you're trying to do it at such an enormous scale of governance, with very many different institutions. So I'm as frustrated as others that things are not moved quicker and that it's taken us 10 years, but the IPCC report did an enormous service. And I think that, even the G7 summit and the way in which successive summits after Paris have affirmed the need for global emissions to be capped and to come down very, very fast is thanks to our scientists who are helping us reach those sort of scientific limits. And this vocabulary of net zero is, I know it's, all concepts that are new take time to socialize, understand, implement, enforce, have compliance with, but it is getting out there and it's making a tremendous difference, I think, in the world.
And finally, we talk about net zero, and you've talked about zero emissions for the power sector and so on. Why don't we just talk about zero emissions? Why do we need to qualify it by saying net zero?
Because the emissions from all anthropogenic related emissions must come to zero, whether they're from the agricultural land use sector or from the emission sector. So they must be in balance. But land use emissions naturally, there's a carbon cycle which is very different from digging up fossil fuels that have been locked into the ground for millions of years and putting them into the atmosphere. So they're very different in terms of their underlying causes. And you need the fossil fuel emissions and industrial gases, which are completely man-made, human-made, and you need them to be declining to zero very, very fast. And you need the emissions essentially from the land use sector to be in balance as a whole between themselves. What you can't have is the land use sector somehow compensating and offsetting and being used by the fossil fuel sector to say, you know, they'll take care of it. We'll carry on emitting as usual. We'll carry on digging up coal, oil and gas, which are essentially permanent stores of carbon on a massive scale and which we've been burning for 300 years. And somehow the land use sector will take care of it all by sequestering all of the excess emissions. And this is the problem, that the net zero concept has been used in some way to give cover to this massive imbalance, which simply cannot be balanced. You simply cannot plant enough trees, you cannot sequester enough carbon through land use to make good for the emissions from the fossil fuel sector. But there is a net carbon balance as a whole, and you know, the word net and the underlying architecture of the reporting and of emissions and of the Climate Change Convention is to, you know, is sources and sinks. And so that's how things are reported. So it was kind of legally sits on top of the way in which we had all of these things, and requires very different things to happen, as I said, in the fossil fuel sector than in the land use sector. But they all in the end have to be zero in terms of what the atmosphere sees.
Great, thank you. So we need effectively zero carbon going into the atmosphere. Thank you very much indeed, Farhana. That's fascinating history and a story of triumph and in the past some disasters. So that's very important that we've actually reached that stage now. But we haven't actually got to an agreement that will show us the way to net zero yet. We have the Paris Agreement, which sets out these overarching targets, but the nationally determined contributions within the Paris Agreement are not adequate to meet the targets of keeping within 1.5 or even well below 2 degrees. And that's why we're meeting at COP26 this year, to try and get better targets from countries that will actually be in line with those overarching climate goals. So for the next part of our session today on getting net zero right, I'm going to move on from that history of how we got to net zero and how we got to where we are now to the current debate around net zero. So I'd like to ask why there is a debate, why some people are concerned about the race to net zero, and how we resolve this ahead of COP26. So I'm going to talk to, in this panel, Richard Black, who is Honorary Research Fellow at Imperial College London and co-author of Net Zero, Despite the Greenwash, It's Vital for Tackling Climate Change, which I think tells you something about his thinking. And also online, we're going to have James Dyke, the Assistant Director of the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter, and he is co-author of Net Zero is a Dangerous Trap. So I think we can tell where he's coming from too there. So James and Richard, can you start? I'll come to you first, James. Explain to me a bit about why there is a debate going on here and why we're talking about this. Thank you.
Okay, well, many thanks, Fiona, and many thanks to the rest of today's participants. I just want to start by saying I am deeply grateful for the vital work that's been carried out over many, many years. And my criticisms of net zero are in no way a reflection on this work. So why have I called net zero a dangerous trap? There is the good. There is rapidly increasing awareness and the need to stop our dangerous interference on the climate system, and net zero has been used to make some good progress on decarbonisation, but there is also the bad. Net zero policies license a burn now, pay later approach in which mitigation delay is hidden within promises of future carbon removals, and there is the ugly. Just last week, Bristol Airport proudly proclaimed it will become net zero if you don't count the emissions from planes using the airport. And earlier this year, Shell presented its net zero plan for continued fossil fuel use well into the middle of this century, which would be offset by planting some trees, which, as Farhana has just intimated, would be a disaster. Now, beyond this blatant greenwashing lies a deeper danger. Having net zero impacts on the climate does not mean net zero impacts on the Earth system, far from it. Now, since the Paris Agreement, bioenergy with carbon capture has become a central part of our efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But the more we look, the more we see how this could devastate biodiversity, threaten food and water security, and not even secure the carbon safely. What net zero is actually allowing us to do is continue with the same destructive increase in energy and material consumption, rather than face up to the facts that we are not going to limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. We instead are inventing fantasies of future technological salvation. If we are to fix net zero, then we need twin targets, clear plans for significant near-term decarbonisation, and I fear anything else left just would take us closer to disaster. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that sounds quite frightening, Richard. Are you frightened?
Never intimidated by anything. I'd like to just start by saying really thanks to Farhana. I mean, I shared an office with Farhana during the time that she was talking about there. Without her efforts, I don't think we would have had this language in the Paris Agreement. So net zero. So it's mandated by science, as Farhana was saying earlier. It's actually mentioned in the IPCC AR5 report from 2013 and again in the 2018 special report on 1.5. So it's mandated by science, and it's in the Paris Agreement architecture, which was fought for by campaigners and by the least developed countries and the small island states, the most vulnerable nations. So given all that, it would be pretty weird to try and tear the whole thing down. And I would actually say that it goes as far as to say that if we didn't actually have a slew of net zero targets out there, we would have to invent them. Just ask yourself a simple question. If the US did not have a net zero target, would people be campaigning for it to set one? I think very clearly they would. And the same with whatever enormo corporation you like to say. And I think a lot of the criticism that's leveled at net zero targets isn't actually a criticism of net zero. It's just that there have always been entities, from the Saudi Arabian government to the fossil fuel industry, and in some cases to airlines and car industry and beyond, that have always tried to slow climate action, and they would be trying to do so whether or not we have the kind of net zero architecture and net zero being a thing out there or not. So net zero, I think it's actually the kind of logical way to see climate action. And it's very clear that a huge number of entities do now see decarbonisation through this lens. 2 years ago, the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, the think tank which I then ran, published the first sort of look at how much of global GDP was covered by net zero ambition. It was 16%. Now it's up to 68%. So that shows you that as a lens, as a way of viewing decarbonisation, it's been massively successful. At the same time, it is a coherent theory of change. I mean, to give an example from history, President Kennedy didn't say, well, let's get 20% of the way to the moon, and then maybe we'll look at doing 30%. He said, no, we're going to the moon, and then left it up to the scientists and the engineers to work out how you do it. So setting that long-term destination and then working out how to get there is actually a logical thing for governments, and it's actually logical for businesses as well. And given where we're at with the urgency of climate action, we don't have time to debate theories of change for another 10, 15 years. I think this is a coherent theory of change. As James was saying, there are some good net zero targets out there, there are some bad ones, and there are some ugly ones. And I think the key opportunity right now is to highlight the good ones as examples of best practice. And what do I mean by good? They've got to have interim targets, they've got to incorporate immediate action, they've got to have an annual reporting mechanism. Basically, they've got to be credible. I think there are a number of entities that have set targets but actually don't quite know how to get there. So there's an opportunity to work with them, whether they be countries or companies, and actually persuade them into the right place. And then the ones that are in it for greenwash, expose them and let's call them out. The point is, once an entity has set a target, made a pledge, it can be held accountable, whether it be a country that's being held to account by voters, or a corporation that's being held to account by a combination of shareholders and campaign groups. If it hasn't set that target, then you don't have anything against which to hold it to account. So let's make all the ugly and the bad targets into good ones. It's going to be progressive. Is that happening? I think it is. We've seen a number of examples now from the US, the EU, Japan, the UK that have set a 2050 target, and then they've come back and looked at their 2030 target and said, actually, we need to set a tougher one. So there is some evidence out there that this theory of change, let's go to the moon and then we work out how to get there. There's some evidence that that's working. And I think this is the key opportunity over the next 2 years, really, is to change all those targets that aren't yet good into robust ones.
Thank you. And how robust is the science behind net zero, though? Because if we've got this idea that we can carry on emitting some emissions from whatever sources, while on the other hand, growing trees, sequestering carbon in soil, restoring peatlands and so on, are we absolutely sure of how much carbon we are able to sequester in that way? Do we know, for instance, how many trees we'd need to grow, how many acres of peatland or other natural areas we would need to restore? Are these calculations even reliable on which people are setting so much store? James, I'll come to you with that.
No. The short answer is no. The longer answer is we've done a bunch of calculations, so you can come up with an amount of land required to limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius would require something like twice the surface area of India planted nothing for trees. Now, that's one of the reasons why the shine has kind of gone off BECCS, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, because that was kind of invented almost to allow us to maintain this kind of narrative that we are going to limit warming to no more than 1.5 whilst we're continuing to increase our carbon emissions. But just like, for example, clean coal, the idea that we could capture the carbon emissions by burning coal, or just previously with the idea back in the 1990s that we could manage our carbon budgets by rapid energy switching or by doing more offsetting, every single time you look at what's been proposed in order to sequester the carbon, the numbers either don't add up or they produce such significant impacts on other parts of the Earth system that we realize that's actually going to be potentially just as bad as the kind of climate change in which we're trying to avoid. And I suppose my greatest concern I've got at the moment is that I would motivate my interventions at this point being targeted actually towards academia, because I think academia has been playing something of a dangerous game. Yes, net zero is it's what the science says, but by using that, we're somehow taking the net zero policies and the net zero approach as being somewhat beyond critical inquiry, right? We need to remember that these net zero policies are coming out of very complicated integrated assessment models, which are not objective, which have got a whole bunch of value statements in there and assumptions. It assumes market-based approaches, incremental only ever approaches. It doesn't really allow us to do the very radical decarbonisation that we would actually need. And all that is being confected in a way which means it's kind of objective, it's scientific, you can't critically engage with it. You just need to say the science is settled. And what this means is every year we march further and further towards beyond 1.5. We're currently on target towards 3 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. But at the same time, the narrative, certainly in a policy and a social context, is that we are, we're on the race to net zero. We're fighting for 1.5. 1.5 is over. I'm getting bored of saying it. I would have some confidence if we were going to limit to 1.5, if at the same time as we're making all these promises, we were seeing large near-term reductions in carbon emissions. 2021 is probably going to see the second largest increase in global carbon emissions ever recorded, because the global economy is rebounding. The global economy is still 80% powered by fossil fuels. There needs to be some systemic, arguably much more radical change. And I suppose the role of academia is helping project this narrative that, don't worry, everything's under control. We just need these progressive incremental policies and we're going to be safe. And we're not.
Okay, thank you very much. Richard, I'd like to come to you then. Does this mean that you, in talking about 1.5 and the possibilities of net zero, are you being naive?
I don't think so. It is all about the application. I definitely don't agree with James that 1.5 is over. We are at the time of maximum urgency, but we're actually at a time of maximum feasibility. and maximum political interest on this. So it is, as I was saying earlier, I think a question of taking the good intentions, taking the best in practice, and basically getting all those entities that are not yet quite on the page with quality net zero targets to have them. Now, the example of forest absorption of carbon is a really good one. It's probably the thorniest area across the whole piece. If an entity is basically saying, I'm not going to reduce my emissions, but I'm going to plant enough trees to absorb them, that's not a serious net zero target. The science is abundantly clear, whether it's from the Royal Society or whether it's some of the excellent work that NGOs have done, that planting trees is not a silver bullet. You've got to have big reductions in your own emissions, and then perhaps if there's a bit that needs to be mopped up at the end, then we can use nature-based solutions for some of that. I think if you look at the history of innovation in the power sector and in electric transportation and increasingly in industry, what you see is a situation where the costs of taking action are, first of all, seem quite big, but very rapidly they come down. And I would be reasonably confident that the cheapest option for the vast majority of sectors is actually going to be to reduce emissions and cut emissions using zero carbon techs, rather than actually to try and plant your way out of it or do things like direct air capture. But this is coming back to the robustness. I think, if an entity is serious, it's set a net zero target, the bulk of that ambition has to be through reducing its own emissions. And in the case of companies, that also has to incorporate scope 3 emissions, the emissions that are produced by its products. Otherwise, it's not a serious target.
Thank you. And yes, just to avoid getting tied up in jargon there, scope 3 emissions are what, Richard?
Well, so for example, if you're an oil and gas company, it's the emissions that are produced when your product is used, not the emissions that you actually create in extracting your product. And that's one of the things that some companies have basically says, yes, we've got a net zero target. And actually, when you look at it, it's nothing to do with the products that they're actually doing. It's to do with, well, we're going to use renewable energy on our oil rigs or whatever it may be.
So if I wasn't including scope 3 emissions, I could be effectively pumping out emissions, but because they're over here and not technically part of my company, I wouldn't need to count them. It does sound, if companies can talk about planting trees in the future, if they can talk about things like you mentioned direct air capture, Richard, which is capturing carbon that's already been emitted from the atmosphere, if they can talk about carbon capture and storage, which is taking carbon at source, say from power stations, burning fossil fuels and burying it in, say, disused oil and gas fields under the sea. If companies can talk about these things, then they can get away with emitting a lot more in the present. How do we prevent them from just using net zero targets as a fig leaf then, Richard?
I think if you're talking about something like carbon capture and storage, it absolutely can be used as a fig leaf, but nevertheless, it also can be part of a suite of robust climate change solutions. I mean, in the UK, the Climate Change Committee, we must call it now, the government statutory advisor, they very much see a role for carbon capture and storage in the future. And if you look at scenarios that the IPCC uses, again, they do as well. The problem is it's not yet a real thing, and it will only become a real thing when governments actually put serious amounts of money into making it happen. And so that's a particularly difficult problem with carbon capture and storage. But your question also contains the sort of dichotomy between what James called sort of burn now and pay later. And we're seeing that cropping up very overtly in the rhetoric of some governments and some companies. I mean, Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister, it's quite clear that if they set a net zero target for 2050, they basically assume pretty much business as usual to 2045 and then rapid decarbonisation through technologies that haven't yet been brought to market. That's not credible, and it needs to be exposed as not credible. But where you have a sector, this is where I think it gets particularly interesting in the sort of nuts and bolts of it. Let's say you have a sector, for example, like let's take cement or something like this, where you have one corporation that has a serious net zero target, they have a plan, they're actually cutting emissions, they've got things in place to deliver it, and you have another one that basically says, well, we're not going to do anything but plant trees. It's pretty obvious which one is the more robust, and therefore that starts to affect the flow of capital investment. It starts to affect the public will. It starts to affect the perception of those countries. So that's why I think it's very important to look at each individual target in its own and look at which one is credible and which one isn't.
Thank you very much. And James, I'd like to come to you for a final word in this section, because is there not a danger when you're talking about, net zero being a dangerous trap and so on? Is there not a danger that, people in the general public who aren't, completely genned up on what are scope 3 emissions or what's carbon capture and storage and so on, that people will just think, oh, well, he's telling us that this is a load of nonsense, so we shouldn't believe any of it anyway? Is there not a danger that people will just turn off when they hear that this is a subject of debate?
I think the only thing I can ensure is that I try and tell the situation as best as I can see it, and I think as best as science can see it. Even in the concepts of net zero, the idea of just being able to offset hard to decarbonize sectors such as aviation or cement, maybe a bit of land use and agriculture, that's gone, right? Really, what net zero is proposing is net negative. Because we have overshot the budget required for 1.5, the serious proposals are now, by the middle of this century, we will spin up carbon sequestration schemes that will take down up to the order of 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the Earth's atmosphere and run that for the rest of the century. And we will need to do that because we're going to significantly overshoot 1.5, 1.7, 2 degrees, maybe 2.5, maybe 3, and then we'll somehow manage to recover it by the end of this century. So when people say that the Paris Agreement is still in play, 1.5 is still alive, that's because there's going to be a significant overshoot and then a correction. Now, this is important. We need to tell people what we are signing up for, well, actually what we're signing our kids up for, because it's our children and future generations who are going to have to make this stuff work. And if it doesn't work, if there's a pandemic, if there's a global climate collapse, if there's a war, if there's some other kind of calamity, which means they can't run this carbon sequestration machinery, they could be seeing even more significant rates of warming than we have done thus far, right? We've warmed the average surface temperature of the planet by about 1.2 degrees Celsius. We will soon exceed 1.5. The only chance that people have for keeping the Paris Agreement is in play is by essentially inventing these future technologies. I think it's a much more serious situation that we need to be honest with the public and say, in the absence of large-scale reductions in the burning of fossil fuels right now, not the middle of the century, not net zero by 2050, we need to see it like tomorrow. We're not going to limit to 1.5. We're not going to have the Paris Agreement, and we're going to be significantly putting our children and future generations at risk, either because we'll be in the middle of climate breakdown, or they'll be having to invest tremendous amounts of money, energy, materials to make these machines work to basically clean up our mess.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, James. Thank you, Richard. And thank you to all three of you, to Farhana as well, because I think all three of you are going to be staying for the debate later when we will take questions from the audience. So thank you very much for the first half of what we're trying to do today, talking about getting net zero right. There are questions coming in, I can see on the Q&A, so please do keep them coming. We will move, after this next panel discussion, we will move into questions and answers, and then you will be able to talk to our panelists and ask them all of your questions directly. I'm going to move on to the next part of our discussion, which is about the future of net zero. We've got a panel for you today. We've got Jennifer Morgan, who's the Executive Director of Greenpeace International. We've got Tom Hill, who's the Associate Professor in Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. He's also the chair of the UN Race to Zero Independent Expert Peer Review Group. We've got Shapora Berman, International Programme Director of Stand Earth and Chair at Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. We've got Nigel Topping, UN high-level climate champion for COP26, and Gonzalo Munoz, who is the UN high-level climate champion for Chile. Chile, as you know, were the hosts of COP25, the last time we were able to hold a COP, which was in 2019. I'm going to come to each of those in turn. And I'm going to ask, really, we've heard about the history of net zero. We've heard about some of the current debate. We've got COP26 coming up very shortly now, just at the beginning of November. And we don't have a lot of time, really, do we, to sort out these problems. The IPCC has told us we need to halve emissions in the next decade if we're going to stay within 1.5 degrees. So if we can't even agree on what target we need to get to, if we can't even agree on what net zero is, that doesn't seem to bode very well for progress and for actually meeting those targets. So I'd like to ask each of you in turn, what do you think of the future of net zero? And I'll start with you, Deborah Berman. And I'd like to ask, well, how do we sort out all of this confusion? How do we provide a clear path for people, for businesses, for governments, for the whole world in the next few months to COP26?
Thank you, Fiona. I think the previous panel made it very clear. We need to get to zero. And obviously, considering we're at 416 parts per million today, we need to get beyond zero. But I think what's really critical for this discussion is that companies and countries are held to account to getting to zero. And that means short-term targets. It doesn't just mean what the modeling says by 2050. It means what are your plans for 2030? It means what are your plans for this year? And I think one of the great big dangers that we've seen in the net zero conversation is that it's being used to obfuscate, to justify the expansion of fossil fuel production. So to make it very simple, I think what's very critical is that we need to stop expanding fossil fuels. And that means production and emissions. Because while we have made some considerable progress, I think what we tend to forget is that the majority of climate policy and our international agreements to date have been around demand, have been around how do we reduce emissions. But the problem is, as we know from the UNEP and Stockholm Environment Institute Production Gap Report, we're currently on track to produce 120% more fossil fuels than the world can safely burn within a 1.5 degree scenario. And while these debates do become very complicated, 80% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere comes from three products: oil, gas, and coal. And if we just look at some of the recent initiatives like the Net Zero Producers Forum, these are 5 countries, 4 of which are in the top 5 countries in the world planning to expand fossil fuel production today. We have more than enough fossil fuels already under production or already above ground to meet the world's needs while we transition to a renewable future. And I honestly think last month, the REN 21 report was a big wake-up call to all of us, because what we know is that renewable energy is booming, but the cold reality is fossil fuel use is going up and renewables are still not displacing it. What we saw in that report is that the world used 80.3% of fossil fuels to meet our energy needs in 2009. And last year, we used 80.2%. And even more concerning is that fossil fuels took up 75% of new energy demand. So to make it very simple, we need to stop expanding emissions and production. All real plans need to show near-term reductions in absolute emissions. And I think this is the grave danger of the net zero debate, is that we've seen so many countries, including my own in Canada, try and justify the dramatic expansion of the oil sands, of fracking, and even more heavily subsidize the oil and gas companies to continue that expansion with the promise of carbon extraction, as we've talked about already this morning through CCUS and BECCS and other methods. So I think if we're going to be successful in moving forward, we have to bring into the conversation the need for absolute emission reduction targets now, in production decline now. If a company is serious, it shows no new expansion, it shows production decline, because we know we actually need globally a 6% production decline per year in order to meet the Paris targets.
Great, thank you very much. That's a very clear analysis there. Thank you, and we'll move on now to Jennifer Morgan, Executive Director of Greenpeace International. And Jennifer, I'd like to ask you whether we should carry on, whether we should keep the faith in net zero or try to change this target.
Yeah, very good question. Because I think that the history that Farhana Yamin outlined, the legal and the scientific drivers that brought this target, the balance, into the Paris Agreement are still needed, right? We still need, but I think we are now in basically the fight, the power fight for whether net zero can be something that is a driver of change, or if it is going to be captured by the fossil fuel industry and others to keep on doing what they have been doing. So it is a power struggle that we're in right now. And I think what we've seen is the efforts of those companies, whether it be Shell or Total or whatever it might be, that are using a goodwill that was there, an initially very sound idea, in order to continue their business as usual. So I think the answer to your question depends on whether or not those initiatives that are out there on net zero, whether it be Race to Zero or others, are being pure to the science and to the legal intent that was there, which is about reducing fossil fuel emissions down to zero. The short term, as Sapora said, the 2030, what's going to happen in the plans in the next couple of years, or whether they're going to be allowed to use offsets. We haven't talked too much about offsets here, but offsets are a massive problem, and for all kinds of reasons, which if we have time, we can dig into. So, if you think about it in an accountability way, actually, the companies that are making these targets should, number one, be also advocating to get the policies in place to get those reductions down to zero, which most of them aren't. They're part of business associations that are fighting against these things. And they should be focusing only on the things that are real now. And so that's where, with James, I hear you, but I respectfully disagree. There's no geophysical reason why we can't keep global average temperatures within that 1.5 temperature limit. The question is the politics, and the question is whether or not the corporate powers that are dominating right now on one side are allowed to dominate, I would say, further, or whether the politicians, whether the corporate initiatives that are out there listen more to people, listen more to the courts that are now coming forward, and actually put in that accountability mechanism, put in national regulations to have that oversight, so that you don't have these types of schemes that consumers think they're doing something good, but who the heck knows, where those things happen, that have the transparency, that have the short-term robust methodologies. Richard mentioned, scope 1, 2, and 3, which means, all the whole product. If you're an oil company, you're responsible for your oil. That's where it's going to lie. That's the fight in the next months. And I think the COP platform will be a place where we see that battle right front and center.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that message there, Jennifer. And we've got some questions coming up for you in the Q&A later. So thank you for that. Tom, I'm moving on to Thomas Hale now, who, as I said, is the Associate Professor in Public Policy at Oxford, looking at this, and one of the leaders of the UN's Race to Zero expert peer review group. And Tom, you have worked very hard on net zero, on defining net zero, and setting out what good net zero can do, on drawing up some rules and regulations around net zero. Is it rather disheartening to hear people attack net zero?
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you everyone for this great discussion. So I think the attacks are actually really quite helpful and positive, actually, even though I think the concept is, obviously based in science and something we need to protect. As Jennifer said, as many have said, getting it right requires governance, requires operationalizing this in an effective way. And one of the tools that the climate movement can bring to bear to get that balance right is by really having a strong form of accountability, of transparency, of scrutiny of how this idea is being applied. And therefore, I think the controversy we're seeing around net zero is overall healthy, important, and I think will ultimately take us to the right place. Because we don't really have a choice of whether we can get net zero right. We kind of have to. We have to get things down to zero. That's what the science requires. The question is really how. And I think that's really a question of governance. And I admit I'm a political scientist, so I think about how we build political power and then how to use that political power to achieve positive change in the world. And I think with net zero, the old adage really applies perfectly, that winning is easy, but governing is harder. The climate movement has really won the battle of public debate over where we need to get to toward net zero as soon as possible. That emerged in science, it was pushed into the Paris Agreement by Farhana and others. And now, thanks to things like Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion and this climate movement overall, we're seeing a really rapid uptake. A research report we did in Oxford showed that around 70% of the world's GDP is covered by some kind of net zero target. And that's a huge, huge victory. But it won't achieve what we need it to achieve unless we get the rules, the standards, the accountability, and the governance processes right. And I think that's really the task in front of us. I'm encouraged that we're beginning to take some useful steps in the right direction. So I think Race to Zero is a brilliant entry into this debate because it's really been a process through which the high-level champions have brought together a community of ambitious, progressive non-state actors, cities, businesses, investors, civil society groups, scientists, to think about how you set a good net zero target and what that looks like in practice. And indeed, it has all these features of having a plan, focusing on immediate emissions reductions, including 50% reduction in CO2 by 2030, having limits on how offsetting can be used. All of that is really key to setting out the frontier of best practice. And I really I'm grateful for Nigel and Gonzalo, who we'll hear from in a second, for helping the world come together to define what that frontier of best practice really looks like. And now it's being thought through and operationalized in different standards like the Science-Based Targets Initiative or Cities Race to Zero or these other methods. And that's complex and it's technical, but it's also fundamentally political because it's about defining the rules and standards that will determine the outcome of this most important challenge that we face. So I think it's a useful step forward. But Race to Zero is a UN-based voluntary campaign. It's about mobilizing action. It's about defining the frontier of best practice. It's about helping us all understand what the direction of travel is and how we get there. But it's not a global regulatory body, and nor should we expect it to be. We need to make sure that these rules, these ideas that are being worked out through this group of leaders is going to be incorporated into the practice of business, into the fundamental requirements of how we organize the economy, ultimately in regulations. And I think we're beginning to now see that emerge. You might have seen, I'm sure many of you saw, a pretty interesting court case in Holland recently where Shell was compelled to set a higher net zero target because of the court's decision that its current target was not actually, was putting too much burden onto future generations, wasn't doing enough in the short term. That decision cited extensively. I was quite surprised to see from our kind of consultations we had done in the Race to Zero campaign with actors last year, thinking about what a good net zero target looks like. So this kind of process of bringing actors together, thinking about how rigorous net zero can be operationalized, getting it in line with science, can have huge impacts. And I think it must take this next step into the governance and rulemaking architecture to get there. And final point, the scrutiny and the accountability is exactly what's needed to make that distinction between to help the world take this next step to credible operationalization of net zero, not just winning public argument about where we need to get to, but actually making it stick in regulation, in the way businesses are organized, and in the way we all live our lives. So, can we make net zero work? I think we must. I think we can if we govern effectively. I think we're beginning to take some steps to make that happen. And I think the scrutiny and demands for accountability will be a really important part of how we take the next step.
Thank you very much, and an important call for scrutiny and accountability there. Thank you, Tom. I'm going to move on now to Nigel Topping, who, as I said, is the UN high-level climate champion for the UK in the lead up to COP26. Nigel, the race to zero, it sounds like a good thing, but can you tell us exactly how the race to zero is actually improving our chances of staying within 1.5 degrees and how it's contributing to COP26, please? Thanks.
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks everyone for the conversation. I think it's through having these really kind of frank conversations about the nuances and the difficulties that we're going to make all of our work much stronger and have much better chances. I mean, the race to zero. Actually, the provenance is really something that the Chileans, as incoming president of COP25 and the Secretary General, did in creating something they call the Climate Ambition Alliance, which Gonzalo can maybe talk to, which is the idea of creating a group of countries committed to net zero. And what Gonzalo and I decided to just over a year ago when we launched the Race to Zero, say, look, it would be a good thing if we had as many non-state actors. That's our job as high-level champions, working with businesses, investors, cities, states and regions, universities, etc. It would be a good thing if we had as many of them as possible signaling to policymakers that they're committed to net zero in a robust way. And this is where the devil's in the detail, right? And that's because of something we talk about all the time, which we call it the ambition loop, that you can only go so far as non-state actors before you have to have regulatory change, right? But businesses and investors and cities moving as far as they can does change the politics and makes it easier for politicians to be more ambitious. So a combination of sort of grassroots activism and movement in the real economy changes the politics and makes it easier for politicians to be bolder. So that's what we're hoping, that by mobilizing a critical mass of non-state actors, we can help embolden policymakers to set the regulatory frameworks which then allow us to go faster and faster. But the key is to do it in a robust way, which is why this conversation is so important. So what we've tried to do with the Race to Zero is say you can only be in if you commit to zero in a robust way, which deals with, I think, many of the issues that we've heard about, but not all of them yet, which is why we keep going through a consultation process today. But certainly, from the beginning, we've been clear to be in the Race to Zero, you've got to set a short-term target. You can't just be 2050 on someone else's watch when I've retired. It's got to be, short-term target, just as the Paris Agreement requires countries to have short-term targets. It's got to cover the full scopes 1, 2, and 3, so it can't sort of dodge that question by saying we'll have nice zero carbon offices and everything else that happens upstream and downstream in our business is not affected. It can't rely on offsets instead of reducing emissions in the value chain. And it has to be transparent so that entities can be held accountable. But of course, the actual mechanisms for holding companies and cities and governments accountable, back to Thomas's point, is a broader question of governance. So we've tried to get the basic architecture right. We've been through one sort of annual cycle of consultation to tighten up on some of the criteria. Some of the areas which I think are still challenging, I think it was Jennifer who talked about the need for consistency between companies saying they're going for net zero and the way that they're spending their lobbying dollars in terms of trade bodies and direct public affairs. And there is some great work on that at organisations like Influence Map, which one can look to. The other thing I'd say is that because one of the challenges is that not every sector is born equal. We know we can go faster in some sectors than others. And so in order to get to net zero, we need to go as fast as possible in every sector. That might mean going faster in the power sector than in the steel sector, for example. So what we've tried to do with the Race to Zero is then at a sector level map out what the pathway is and particularly what the short-term breakthrough targets are. And I'm really encouraged that at last the IEA has published a 1.5 degree consistent scenario, and we can all argue with bits of that, but we can argue with it because it's been published, right? It wasn't there before. And I think a lot of I think actually most of what we think needs to be tightened up is more in the beyond 2030, but there's a lot of really strong stuff there. Back to Tsepora's point about stopping exploration for new fossil fuels, for example. So I'm reasonably confident that we're converging, but James' point at the beginning is the key one, that we do have the good, the bad, and the ugly. What we're trying to do with Race to Zero is drive a wedge between the good and the bad and the ugly and really get everybody, and it's a power struggle, as Jennifer says. We need to only be accepting or putting on a pedestal or allowing a leadership platform to those who've got good, robust, short-term, credible net zero targets. And that's what we're trying to do with the Race to Zero, is build that so that it makes it easier for policymakers to do their job.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And that's an interesting way of looking at it, that the businesses, some leading businesses, can create political space, which enables politicians to be bolder in a kind of virtual circle. That sounds very encouraging. I'm going to move on now to Gonzalo Munoz, who is the UN High-Level Climate Champion for Chile. Chile, of course, as I said before, were the hosts of COP25, which was held, it had to be held in Madrid for various reasons, in 2019, which was the last COP that we were able to hold. Of course, COP26 should have been last year and was postponed to this year because of the pandemic. So, Gonzalo, an awful lot has changed since we were last talking about this at COP25. Can you outline for us really how how progress can be made between what happened at COP25 and what we're hoping for at COP26? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Great to see all of my friend panelists here, but also happy to listen to this, as Tom referred to, very healthy conversation that is absolutely necessary in order for improving the role that each of us play in this agenda. As Nigel was referring to, we started as a presidency at that time, incoming presidency at COP, with the idea of activating the ambition loop through voluntary commitment, both from parties and non-party stakeholders. That's how the Climate Ambition Alliance was launched in September 2019, trying to put together everybody that wanted to follow the 1.5 report, mainly, right? And saying, okay, we are committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050 at the very latest. And we had the possibility of putting together a group of both parties at that time, about 100 and few, and up to COP25, 122 parties committing to net zero by 2050, but then also businesses, investors, big regions, and at that time only then cities. We aggregated universities when Nigel joined and proposed the idea on running this massive campaign called Race to Zero. In this case, only mobilizing the non-state actors. That is our role. We cannot mobilize the parties, but we do have the capacity of activating the ambition loop. At the end, that's what we're here for. We are here to show the parties that there is a capacity that they can embrace while setting the right conditions for all non-state actors to do the role. Well, on one side, it's not only about the quite impressive numbers that Richard also referred to, moving from 16% to 68%, and it can also be much higher from now to Glasgow, and hopefully on mobilizing all of them towards the same goal. But we have seen also more and more sectors of the economy understanding that this is the only way that we have in order not only to reach the 1.5 world that we all desire, but also understanding that net zero is also an interim target towards regeneration. So even when it comes to that mess that James was referring to, that we have to put all together, well, emissions is one single element of it. It's a very complex one, we all know this, but there's so much more that we have to put together, and therefore having a common narrative about what we need to reach, having a common narrative of the importance of science. Come on, we're crossing the hardest moment in life through the pandemic. Well, also science has been relevant to understand how leadership can move in the positive direction. We have been seeing increasing number of commitments even in this 18 months. Also, with the absolute concrete concept of the importance of the credibility and traceability elements on it. That's why we're here. So I think that all of those things that that we are talking about today, we're not there not that long ago. The narrative has changed, very positive. It's far from being enough. It's far from being solved. but we have seen an incredible change on narrative, a narrative that again is positioning science, is mobilized towards increasing the level of credibility that is required, the traceability that is required. Also, again, activating that ambition loop. We are seeing many regions and countries where the activity and the ambition set by non-state actors is really allowing countries, parties to move further and faster. But also, as I said, it's about understanding that, again, it's just an interim target. We have to start now regenerating ecosystem. If not, it would not be enough. But then there's another element that I would like to see all of this energy also positioning that end is about the solidarity of the climate ecosystem. And that's why we launched also Race to Resilience as a sibling campaign, because even mobilizing towards the reduction of the emissions, the change on most of the sectors, even recovering in terms of nature capacity, is just one part of the problem that we're facing. So us as community are here also to understand that the urgency is today on mobilizing trillions of dollars to solve the problems that this crisis is and has been generating, and hopefully through both races, and with race we mean running as really fast as you can to reach the goal as fast as you can. That's why we're positioning most of our efforts towards what must happen in this decade. Balancing both agenda is absolutely critical. And Fiona, let me end by saying we are seeing the effects of the narrative, the effects of those commitments by, for example, pension funds in the global north taking the determination, sending the message to their investees around the world, and seeing utility companies around the global south taking the determination of moving forward at the same time, and therefore integrating now SMEs from the global south to this narrative and to the concrete action. We are seeing that every single day. Not enough, of course. Need to be more credible, of course. We need to see the concrete action, but we are seeing here something that probably we haven't seen in the past, that is showing an opportunity, and let's embrace it very strongly.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And thank you very much for that hopeful tone there, and very much a can-do attitude we're hearing there. We'll come to you with some questions in a moment, Gonzalo, but I'm going to turn to some of the panelists we heard from earlier first to get a recap on some of their thinking, given what we've just heard. And we've got some great questions from the audience, which I'm going to put to them now. Just to say to the audience that you can ask your questions in the Q&A. Some of our panelists are answering you in the Q&A. They're putting the answers up there for everyone to see as we speak. That's great. Panelists, please carry on doing that. That's great. We are very multimedia here. So we'll use as many different ways of involving people as possible, and as many different ways of answering questions as we can. So carry on answering questions in the chat and Q&A, and some of our questions I will put live to our panel members now. So first of all on that, I'm going to come to Farhana. Farhana, you talked to us about some of the genesis of the net zero debate, and how this came from the UN climate negotiations. I'd like you to reflect on what we've just heard, and if there's any response you'd like to make to what we've just heard in the intervening panel debates. And also I'd like to ask you, do you think that this whole net zero debate is similar to the attacks that we've had for many years on the UNFCCC itself? The UN is always under criticism for, the negotiations go on every year, but sometimes they can seem not to make a great deal of progress. Do you think that it's the process that's faulty here, or is it some of the bad faith people involved in it? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. Thank you for all the questions as well. I think when a good idea comes to the table and is having traction, I think those who are going to be impacted negatively can try and destroy it, sometimes by destroying the reputation of the people who put it forward through smears, we've seen that with climate science and our climate scientists, and sometimes by co-opting it, which is what's happening in this case, and I think Jennifer's right. We need to look at where are the rubbish ways of doing net zero coming from? Who is downgrading this idea? Who is diminishing it? And it's true that, there is academic questioning, is this the right phrase and so forth. But I, for one, sometimes academics and sometimes activists are, well-intentioned, but we can play into the hands of those who are actually trying to undermine, a decade's worth of negotiations, which is what this is, a decade's worth of negotiation. And net zero, as I said, was one concept out of many put forward by those 100 vulnerable countries. It sat alongside 1.5. It sat along a 5-year ambition period. It sat alongside, common accounting. Some of these rules are now being, negotiated for completion in Glasgow. So it sat alongside a global goal for adaptation on the other side. So this was a suite of well-balanced ideas. And I would urge the activists and the academics to try and not get 195 countries to reinvent the table, to reinvent the song sheet, but to really focus in on accountability and of challenging vested interests who, as I said, want to take the path of least resistance and to co-opt and greenwash and, pass off business as usual all over again. And we see this dynamic over and over again. And luckily that dynamic is being challenged on the streets. It's being challenged by the new social movements. It's being challenged in courts. And I think having a global cap and a clear end date is exercising the ingenuity and inventiveness of the good business community, of thousands of civil societies, of local authorities and others who have set actually much more rigorous end dates, sometimes 2030 targets for a full phase out. And we should be focusing on those. So I would have liked to have had on this panel, Fiona, those who have set themselves 2030 is the new 2050 targets and who are really rigorously, tackling the underlying systems, tackling the need for fossil fuel emissions in the first place. As Sephora's rightly said, it's largely a production problem. We have an overproduction problems, and sometimes we're dealing with emissions which are the end consequence. And we really now need to have a phase out of production. And again, net zero is, I think, in the end, shining a spotlight on those conversations, which are long overdue. So I welcome all of those who are going to hold the feet of everyone to account. And actually what we need is a law in every country mandating net zero and defining it. That's what we need. So this, international goal was meant to be implemented and enforced through national legislation. We shouldn't have to do it company by company, city by city, local authority by local authority. Governments can do that. And that's the next big thing that I think we should work on. And do it on the basis of climate justice and just transition, which are referenced. Here I am pointing to my copy of the Paris Agreement. These are referenced and answer the question which I may not come to. Paris needs to be far more inclusive. It needs to pay much more attention to climate justice. It needs to pay much more attention to just transition. And those are the big overarching themes in a post-COVID world. We have to build a far more inclusive world and address the inequalities that already exist.
Thank you, Farhana. Thank you for that. And that's a very important point that you raise about inclusivity there. And in fact, I've got a question on that, which I'm going to put to you, Gonzalo, which is, can you comment on whether net zero is sufficiently inclusive, specifically with reference to the global south? And if not, how can it be made so? Gonzalo, if you could take on that for us, please. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fiona. Great question. And of course, no, the agenda is still not inclusive enough. I mean, we are, again, far from that. Having said that, nevertheless, we have done great progress. So when it comes, for example, Race to Zero, we have more than 4,000 businesses as part of Race to Zero. Almost 1,200 of them are certified B corporations committed to 2030, not to 2050, with their net zero target. And for example, almost 700 of them are from Latin America. We are seeing a progress on how these all the messaging, all the concepts, even the technologies that are related to a net zero commitment makes total sense to even SMEs from all around the world. We launched the SME Climate Hub in order to help to support not only more inclusiveness in terms of sizes of companies, but also allowing these big businesses to integrate their value chain into their commitment. We are seeing the same thing when it comes to cities. More than 200 of the cities are from Argentina. We just had Minas Gerais in Brazil joining Race to Zero, and believe me, that is immediately creating the FOMO in Brazil, and we're having other major regions in Brazil joining hopefully very soon, the largest one. We are seeing how much of that is both coming from direct commitments from SMEs, and many times that is related to the people, to the person. I am an entrepreneur myself. Both of my companies are part of Race to Zero, and that is related to the people that work there that need to have their values represented in what the company does, but also how the company do things and where do they purchase from. We are seeing the same thing when it comes to, again, multinationals that need to deploy their commitment all around the world. Well, they are now speaking to all of their subsidiaries around the world, and we see that same thing when it comes to subnational governments. All of that very well articulated in this moment by the financial sector. So GFANZ having those $72 trillion, having expressed on an intention to become net zero by 2050, believe me, already is creating ripples. Of course, totally agreeing on what Jennifer said and Farhana, we have to check very well where's the rubbish and try to clean it as fast as possible. That's what the race is about. Bring as much as possible together into the race, and then start moving away those that are not running and cheering on those that are going faster. For example, as I said, the B Corp movement. Then we have the climate pledge that had a commitment towards 2040. There's a lot of things happening, and we're seeing how much of that resonates very properly when it comes to the global south. But again, let me refer to race to resilience. When it comes to the global south, the inclusion part is not only about having more parity, having more inclusion when it comes to the voices. It's not only about the mitigation part of it. We need to go a lot stronger when it comes to the solidarity and bringing the capacity of the global south to increase the resilience toward the climate crisis.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. And let's hope that we do hear a lot more from the Global South in the run-up to COP26. Thank you. I'm going to move on now to James. You've been answering questions in the Q&A in chat. Thank you very much for that. But I think there's a feeling by some questioners that you've been quite negative about some aspects of net zero. But what are you proposing that's positive in its place? How would you run this? James?
Yeah, so I've been, some of the responses to my contributions have been, well, so what have you got, right? What's your answer? And I think we need to be clear about what the situation that we're currently in. So for example, I mean, regards to, let's say 1.5, I completely agree with Jennifer. It's not physically impossible to limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's nothing in the laws of thermodynamics. But no one believes we're going to limit warming to no more than 1.5. No one believes that's going to happen. The best we're offering is a kind of an overshoot and then a recovery. And that's going to hand on a vast debt onto our kids. That's an important different way in which we should be framing what net zero is assuming, what we can do with net zero. And once we do that framing, then surely that would promote the question, well, how can we hand over this vast debt to future generations? And the argument is they will be able to afford it because the global economy will be larger. So what net zero is doing is essentially further supporting this kind of destructive appropriation of nature, the biosphere, in order for the continual growth in our economies. So I'd be more than happy to talk about different ways in which we can approach the tremendous challenge that we've got, and I think that can be constructive. So yes, let's set twin targets. If a net zero target consists of the amount of greenhouse gases that are going to be emitted and the amount that are going to be removed. At the moment, that's being hidden by just focusing on the net zero number. So let's make them concrete. Let's make them explicit. Let's have a laser-like focus on what organizations, countries, as Farhana said, at a national level, what is that country going to do in terms of mitigation? And if it's not really doing much on mitigation because it's front loading an awful lot of its commitments in terms of future removals, then we should call it out for that. We should use those kind of legal levers. We should use those activism levers. And, let's remind ourselves, why have we seen this increase in concern about the climate and ecological emergency? Why were Extinction Rebellion activists, locking themselves to railings on Waterloo Bridge in London? And why has Greta Thunberg been leading school children out of their schools on a Friday? It's not because of net zero. You don't see placards for net zero. You see placards that we need to keep their future safe. My concern is that the essential appeasement of this continual increase in energy and material consumption of our voracious civilization allows us this kind of fiction that we can have our cake and we can eat it. Nobody needs to make any large changes to their lifestyle right now. We can use incremental market-based approaches and everything's going to be fine. It's not going to be fine. We are not going to limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Nobody thinks that. We are in an overshoot scenario, at which point we may be initiating tipping points, and then we're off the map. So rather than cost optimization, we should be looking at risk mitigation. We shouldn't shy away from the potential significant risks that we and future generations face. I think Farhana and everybody else on this event today have got the machinery, have got the kind of the tools. We just need to work that system much, much faster. And if we can do that at the same time as having some really quite deep, potentially quite radical discussions about economic growth, about what's considered to be politically feasible, then that would be great.
And just to be clear on that, James, and just a one or two word answer, if you wouldn't mind. Do you think that further economic growth is incompatible with tackling climate breakdown?
I think you cannot expect rich developed nations to continually increase their energy and material consumption driven by ever increasing GDP. I think that's one thing we must address. There's more than enough resources for everybody to not go hungry, to have sufficient levels of energy, and for us to reduce our impacts on the Earth system. So I think growth is something that we would definitely have to tackle with.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And can I move on that question to Tom Hale, please? Are we able to combine economic growth with a commitment to combating climate change? And how do we do that? Thanks.
Thanks, Fiona. I think, first of all, I think James, it makes me a little bit, depressed to hear you say that you think 1.5 is just, everyone agrees it's not achievable. I don't think everyone agrees it's not achievable. I think it's achievable with huge effort that's required. And that is something that if we let go, I think we will break the solidarity point that Gonzalo mentioned, that Farhana mentioned. That deal that was part of the Paris Agreement was a bargain between of the whole world to say we will do our best effort to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees and certainly keep it well below 2 degrees in order to ensure this planet will remain livable for the vast majority of people on it now and then to come. And I think that must be the focus of our efforts, because otherwise we'll lose that critical building block that was put in place in Paris. I think the clear-eyed analysis, of course, is that it's increasingly difficult if we don't do immediate emissions reductions ASAP. And I think we've seen in the global pandemic a huge hit to world economic growth, as Fiona's coming back to your question, huge hit to world economic growth because of a pandemic and a consequent fall in global emissions. But even with this huge impact on our economy, global emissions didn't fall enough. This is, I think, a really important point, because it reminds us that actually what we don't need is just to turn off everything. That's not going to be enough to get us to where we need to get to. We need to actually transform the economy, transform our systems, transform ourselves from a carbon-dependent economy to an entirely different one. And so I think I see the lens not so much as growth or degrowth, but rather as how do we accelerate this transformation? And that's the real question that's going to, as I'm saying, take governance, take rules, take policies to achieve. There's a lot of open questions there. I think Race to Zero has done a great job of bringing together the community to talk about things like how do we actually define the residual emissions for this sector? What kinds of scenarios that should we take and emphasize in the IPCC? How much should they rely on this or that? That's exactly the detailed technical conversations that we need to have to work out, and that's where these important distributional questions will be, and who has to do what. But if we give up on this idea that 1.5 remains possible, I think we'll lose our traction, lose our ability to actually hold people to account. And so we need to keep that alive, even as we're clear-eyed about the system's transformation away from fossil fuels and toward a healthier, more resilient economy that we need to do to get there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that rather more optimistic view. And I'm going to move on to Chipora now, who we heard from earlier on. And I'd like to ask, because we've had a few references to the finding by the International Energy Agency that we must stop fossil fuel development and exploration and expansion beyond this year if we're going to stay within 1.5 degrees. Do you think that that should actually be a target at COP26? And what do we need to do to incorporate the IEA's very stark advice on the future of fossil fuels into this whole debate and into what we achieve at COP26? Thanks.
Thank you. We absolutely have to stop the expansion of oil, gas, and coal if we're going to meet the Paris targets. And in some ways, it's just a massive missing piece of the climate policy debate internationally, because the Paris Accord was designed to negotiate demand and emissions, not production. And the problem that we currently have is that, no country or company can do this alone. Stopping the expansion of fossil fuel production is going to require international cooperation, especially if we're going to ensure equity and justice in a global just transition. There are so many countries in the global south, for example, that are expanding fossil fuel production because they have to feed their debt. Look at new oil drilling in the heart of the Amazon, in the buffer zones of uncontacted nations, and in Ecuador and Peru. This is happening just to feed debt. So if we're going to ensure that we stop that, it's going to require new agreements, new international cooperation. The really strange situation that we have right now is that the majority of the world's financial, political, and intellectual capital is still going to building out fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, three products that we know are literally killing us. The oil and gas industry is operating at the bottom of the S&P. They have more bankruptcies than any other sector, and now it's cheaper in most jurisdictions to build renewables at scale. But we're still building out more and more fossil fuels. It's in part because of what Jennifer referred to as the political influence of the fossil fuel companies. And quite honestly, we're seeing that in the UK in the run-up to COP. This is the UK government hosting COP and permitting, and in fact, financially supporting the expansion of more oil drilling in the North Sea and other fossil fuels. We see it in my own country, where more money in British Columbia, where I live, has gone to direct subsidies for expanding fracking than it has gone to implementing the entire climate plan. So if we are going to change this, we're going to need international cooperation. We're going to need countries to commit to no new financing, to reduce and eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, no more approvals of fossil fuel expansion, and it has to start in the wealthy countries first. And the idea that 80% of the planned expansion of fossil fuels right now is in the global north, is in the US, it's in Canada, it's in Norway, it's in the UK. Wealthy countries need to act first. And certainly we're already starting to see that with Denmark, Spain, no new drilling, but we need countries in the global north to be putting in place regulations and a plan for reducing fossil fuel production. Everybody knows that we're going to have to reduce fossil fuel production, but no one wants to plan for it. And when your house is on fire, you shouldn't be adding more fuel.
Thank you. That's a very important point, and we do need to plan for it. And I'm just planning for our audience to be allowed to stay on an extra 5 minutes or so because we've got so many questions and such a great debate going. So we're going to overrun slightly, just letting you know, so hopefully you can all carry on. And following on from what we've just heard there from Sephora, I'd like to turn to Jennifer, because we have had some good news lately, haven't we, in the form of the recent court cases in the Netherlands in particular and so on, where Shell got told that they had to go back to the drawing board and do better on net zero. We have seen companies, really big multinational companies, being held to account in the courts in this way. Will we see more of that? Does that provide a route to enabling us to get to net zero?
Yeah, no, most definitely, I think. And there's two kinds of cases that we're now seeing recently with findings coming out. The first are the corporate ones, which was mentioned in regards to Shell and being told that they needed to reduce much more and that their plans thus far were far away from what's needed, which also had a human rights rationale behind it. You're seeing a Philippines Human Rights Commission that's been petitioned by victims of way back, typhoon, and against the carbon majors. You are seeing the city of New York. You are seeing cities across the world actually now also suing fossil fuel companies, the carbon majors as a whole, not only the fossil fuel companies, but those that, according to attribution science, can be attributed to certain rise in temperature. But you are also seeing governments being held to account. And also, and I think this gets to this intergenerational equity point, which I want to come back to. In Germany, the Constitutional Court, the highest court in the land, recently found in favor of 9 plaintiffs, youth plaintiffs who are also farmers, basically saying that the low target of the government of only 55% was keeping those young people from having a future with the same rights as those generations today, because they would have to reduce emissions so dramatically that their quality of life would be damaged, and also, of course, from the climate impacts. And in 1 week, they're still working through the law, you had a government full of, conservative government with a lot of corporate interests, increasing its target from 55 to 65. And I think that's the type of intergenerational equity measures that we need. And that's the part of, the frame should be fight like hell to keep 1.5 alive with the highest probability that we have, rather than dismissing it and saying people don't believe in it anymore. I mean, that is, and the tools I think that are coming forward, I find it very interesting in the courts. It's kind of like governments are inept because they're only listening to these short-term interests, and they're not listening to actually the citizens, and therefore courts are starting to intervene. And I think that does get to a systems change. I agree it is about systems change, but that's at a fundamental level. It's about actually having the rules put in place in terms of those mandatory reductions, not voluntary programs. And it's, valuing the well-being of people and the planet over the short-term corporate interests. And I'll just end by, one example. In France, there's also been a case. In Belgium, there's also been a case that was found in favor of those working for climate justice. Greenpeace France has put forward a proposal that there should be a national law of every company to get down to zero, and if they don't meet their targets, they cannot pay out to their shareholders. This is the type of accountability that we need. And I think, one piece for Race to Zero, perhaps I get the ambition loop, but also, let's expose and make sure that those companies are following what people want, rather than kind of continuing to do the regular business as usual lobbying. So let's work together on that as well. But yeah, Fiona, it's the courts, I think, are playing a role. There's over 1,000 cases worldwide right now underway.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Well, we'll see what comes of those 1,000 cases. And I'd like to just turn to Richard for a final question about accountability here. We've got companies and governments being taken being held to account through the courts. Is there some easier way in which we can hold companies to account when they come out with these net zero targets, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, there are obviously a lot of organisations out there, Science-Based Targets Initiative and CDP and so on, that can do both the accrediting and the advising that a lot of companies and cities and so on will need. But there isn't sort of one overall arbiter. And I think there is a danger, there's definitely a danger that a sort of market opens up here in what you might call dodgy accreditation. Because if you've got companies that want to see their dodgy targets accredited, it's probable that someone will come forward and say, well, I'll do that. In fact, I've sort of seen indications that might already be happening. So how to make this okay, I don't know. I have heard suggestions that maybe the UN should set up a kind of arbitration body. I think we've got some way to go before we get there, but I definitely do think it is a field to watch. I'd just like to make one comment, if I could, Fiona, on this sort of 1.5 Celsius issue, if I may. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but if you look at the commitment in the Paris Agreement, it doesn't basically say countries will make efforts to achieve 1.5, but actually if they don't, then they'll just give up. That commitment is there in perpetuity, and if we do have an overshoot, the commitment is still there to bring it back down again as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much. That's an important point there. I'm going to wrap up this discussion now, but it seems a bit unfair. We've had so many panelists saying such great things. I'm going to give everyone a very, very brief chance to say one thing about what they want people to take away from this. The debate today was called Getting Net Zero Right. What's the one thing that you think is the most important in getting net zero right? I'm going to come to each of our panelists. You're going to have about 15 seconds each, so you'd better be quick. Nigel, I'll come to you first. Thanks.
Being clear to distinguish between the good and the bad and the ugly.
Thank you very much. That was admirably succinct. Tom, you next, please.
Mobilizing the full power of the climate movement to ensure not just net zero becomes the framework, but also is operationalized effectively in real governance.
Thank you very much. James, I'll come to you next, please.
Let's focus on twin targets. Let's be clear about what the plans are for mitigation, and let's keep the Paris Agreement alive by being honest about where we are and where we're actually heading.
Honesty, great thing. Thank you very much. Gonzalo, I'll take your last word now, please.
I would say not only use the traditional powers of voting and purchasing, use the power of your talent wherever you are and push in the organization, but also use your relationship and the capacity of love and empathy towards moving this agenda forward faster.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that message. I'll take you next, Deborah.
We need absolute emission and production declines today, not in 2050, but starting today. And in order to ensure a global just transition, we're going to need greater international cooperation. So join us at fossilfueltreaty.org.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Jennifer, your final word. Getting net zero right.
We need real solutions, not false solutions like offsets. And for that, the politicians need to listen to people and not continue to allow corporations to set the rules.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And then finally, I'll come to you, Farhana. We started with you with the whole history of net zero and how we got there and where we are now. So what do you think about getting net zero right? What's the most important thing? Thank you.
Oh, thank you for giving me the final word. So I want to bolt the climate justice and just transition elements onto net zero, and that will help make sure that actually people and those inequalities, which is at the heart of all of the social problems that we're seeing, are diminished, and that climate change helps us get to a better world, and that net zero, in fact, is the fundamental lever for getting us there. And I think that that means actually focusing on zero emissions from the fossil fuel sector, first and foremost, zero emissions from the fossil fuel sector. We've got other treaties that will take care of and are supposed to deliver oceans, biodiversity, Indigenous rights and others, our job in the climate movement was to deliver the zero emissions from the fossil fuel sector.
Brilliant, that's admirably succinct there. Well, thank you very much, Farhana, and thank you to all of our panelists today. We've had a fantastic debate. We've had huge participation from the audience there, and a lot of your questions have been answered online as well as live, so thank you for that. Getting net zero right is a complex process, but as we can tell from this debate, a very important one. So I'd just like to say thank you to all of our panelists for taking part. Thank you most of all to our audience for making this the great debate that it was. And I'm sure that you will have other questions as we go forward. There's going to be a huge opportunity for everyone to take part in many debates between now and COP26. So let's hope that this provides a model for engagement. Thank you very much indeed to everyone. Thank you.